Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Peace, and as a board representative of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, I want to welcome you all to our first Spotlight program. The purpose of the Spotlight program is to increase the awareness and understanding of nonpartisan efforts to reform and improve our representative democracy by elevating the nonpartisan conversation about reform between reform leaders, journalists, elected officials, and practitioners. I want to particularly thank Unite America for organizing and co-hosting this first Spotlight to discuss important issues related to the administration of elections during a pandemic and how election reform can improve our representation and the ability of elected officials to represent more voices. Today, we have more than a dozen local, state, and national journalists, nearly 100 state legislators, and dozens of reform practitioners on the line. NANR was established in 2017 between 10 national reform organizations that recognize both the difficulty and the need for structural reforms that realign the incentives created by our election process to produce less partisan governance and better representation of the broad spectrum of the electorate. In less than 3 years, the association has grown to more than 50 dues-paying members to coordinate, collaborate, and build the institutional knowledge and assets that can help us achieve nonpartisan reform against a hyper-partisan atmosphere. With that, I'll turn it over to Nick Troiano, Executive Director of Unite America, a founding board member of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, and somebody for whom this wouldn't be possible. For those of you who don't know Nick, he's a tireless worker, committed to nonpartisan reform, and I'm proud to serve with him on NANR. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chad. Thanks everyone for joining and also bearing with a few technical difficulties there. And thanks to NANR for bringing this growing ecosystem of reformers together. We're proud to be a founding member and also co-hosting today's briefing. I also want to thank Tyler, Beth, and Blake on our team for helping to organize as well. This spotlight today, as Chad was referencing, is focusing on how to administer an election during a pandemic. But the conversation isn't theoretical. We designed this to focus on the lessons learned and the stories of success from the states that have already had to do this over the past few months, which I think can inform all of our work going forward. Specifically, we're going to focus on reforms like vote at home and ranked choice voting, which have played key roles in ensuring the resilience of our elections. This past primary season, we saw 5 states use ranked choice voting in presidential primaries for the first time. Close to a dozen moved to all-mail elections. And where we saw the combination of these reforms, we saw higher turnout, fewer wasted votes, and as a result, more representative outcomes of elections. So this timing of this conversation couldn't be more important because we're headed towards November election and states are wondering how to do this among persistent threats from the pandemic, as well as considering how to optimize elections going forward past November. Maintaining the trust and integrity in our elections is a foundational issue that we think affects every other issue that we care about. It's also not a partisan issue. It's about making sure every voice is heard and every vote is counted. And that's why Unite America and through the Unite America Fund, we're proud to be supporting this work. Our institutes published 2 white papers. I direct you to uniteamericainstitute.org to read more about on both vote at home and ranked choice voting, as well as those of our partners that you'll hear from today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed moderator, David Hawkings, who many of you know as a journalist who spent 3 decades covering American government, especially in Congress. In 2018, he became the founder or editor-in-chief of the Fulcrum, which is a wonderful resource for all the happenings of the democracy reform movement. If you haven't already, sign up for their newsletter at thefulcrum.us. And so, David, we are glad for you facilitating this panel today and look forward to hearing from all of our panelists. And I think you're on mute.
Unmute. Oh, I got the power to unmute myself. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Chad, with whom we partner in some ways with his IVN news site, which the Fulcrum has a deal with, and with Nick at Unite America, who has, in addition to being a great source, is also helping the Fulcrum. So a pleasure to be with you. My own view is that the moderator who moderates best is the one who says the least. So I'm going to try and hustle right along here and get to our group. So in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce all four of them at once, and then we're going to ask each of them to just sort of set the stage for us in their own way in just about 2 minutes time. Then we will I'll try and get the questioning started for several minutes, and then I will pay attention to the Q&A box on the screen and try and get to your questions. Fortunately for all of us, the folks on the panel have somewhat intuitive backgrounds. So I'll start with Amber McReynolds, who has the flag and vote background. I've been in a couple of panels with her before. We were at the NANR convention in Denver in December, when what she had to say sort of seemed a little bit esoteric, or even like not a top tier topic back in December. That was so long ago. And now, of course, she is at the center of one of the most important and pressing democracy reform stories of the year as the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute, a position that she took after running the elections in Denver for many years. Let's see, the one with the most bland background is also one of the most outspoken and forceful leaders in the field, Rob Richie, who is the leader of Fair Vote, has been with Fair Vote, I think, since its inception, has been running Fair Vote for several years. Fair Vote is best known as for advocating for ranked choice voting, which, if you haven't been to the Fulcrum today, Rob, you did see that the ranked choice voting won our Democracy Madness tournament. We asked readers to vote for the 64, to whittle down the 64 most prominent ideas for fixing democracy. Over the last 2 months, heated competition and ranked choice voting won the tournament over the weekend. Rob also talks about multi-member districts and the National Popular Vote Compact and all sorts of alternative election methods. So that is Rob. Amelia Powers Gardner, with the law books, is the Republican county clerk and auditor of Utah County, Utah, which is Provo. And the reason she is with us is that she was the only county clerk in her state to administer a ranked choice election, and also has been at the forefront of trying to figure out a way to do mobile voting in a way that is trustworthy, reliable, efficient, etc. Finally, the obviously labeled KDP Kansas, our final colleague, Vicki Hyatt, who is the chairwoman of the Kansas Democratic Party, and Kansas, for those of you who don't know, was one of the handful of states that went to a ranked choice voting system for its presidential nominating process. So that is why each of them are here, and I guess I'll go sort of in that order. Why don't we start with Amber? And as I say, let's do 2 minutes each, and then try and hustle it along to the world of questions and answers. So we'll start with you, Amber.
Okay, good. There it is. I couldn't unmute. Sorry. I was trying. Well, good to see everyone today. Thank you, David, for the intro, and thank you to Chad and Nick for hosting this very important discussion. As mentioned, I'm formerly election official, now running a democracy reform organization that has taken center stage, really, with regards to the 2020 elections. I really wish that more people would have listened to some of the advocacy we were doing a couple years ago, because we would have been a lot farther along in a lot of states. But the bottom line is we're doing everything we can to make sure states can implement the expansion that is inevitable. Voters around the country are requesting their vote by mail ballots in record numbers. We've seen that in every primary that's happened as of late. Some of the challenges with the request process, as most states have, is that there are significant amounts of data entry that go into that. Voters aren't always sure when they're going to get their ballot in the mail. Some of that clarity hasn't necessarily been implemented extremely well in some of the primaries, but bottom line, it's a massive shift and it's inevitably increasing. And And the key really is that voters have the choice to request their ballot by mail. It's not up to the governors, it's not up to the Secretary of States, it's not up to local election officials or elected politicians. It's up to voters to decide if they want to use this method of voting. And they are using this method of voting in record numbers like we've never seen before. So what we're really focused on is trying to help states make sure they're ready for that increase in volume, make sure they have the right policies in place to handle it, and make sure that at the same time we can also deliver our democracy to voters, interestingly, mostly through the post office likely this year, but also strengthen it at the same time and make sure that we make the key strategic improvements that are so needed around many states around the country. So really grateful to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Rob, we'll go to you next, just because the way it's arranged on my screen, that makes the most sense. Yep.
So I'm up next. Thank you. And great panel to be on. Thank you, David. And I wanted to shout out to Amber and Amelia as people in the election official community who are among those who are ready for change. And it's a tough place to be running elections, and often a place where people are wary of change. And when you run into people like Amber and Amelia ready to deal with the challenges of the day, but also look to ways to make things better, it's exciting and great to be on a panel with you. Ranked choice voting, as those who follow the Fulcrum democracy contest, it's on a roll in a kind of an exciting way. I would say, I've worked in this a long time. I think that's always made sense, but really for 3 years, it's sort of been on a string of both political and implementation success. Back in 2017, actually a person who just won a key primary in New Mexico won a lawsuit in Santa Fe that led to Santa Fe using ranked choice voting. That worked really well. 5 new cities used it in 2019. All the regular cities, or 11 cities using it last year. They all had higher turnout than expected. The way it's being implemented has gone well. And then Vicky and other state Democratic Party leaders this year in 4 other states used ranked choice voting, 4 of them using it entirely for their elections to build into the crowded Democratic field for president. In a very smart way, because in a big field like we saw for president, there's a lot of candidates, and so people will have preferences for more than one. And ranked choice voting gives you a chance to express your first choice, go all in with your first choice, but express backup choices. More than, it was used across these states, there were more than 200,000 votes cast. People on average cast more than 3 rankings. And it kept votes in play. It made a lot more votes count. There were more than 2 million votes this year in other primaries where people voted for a candidate who had dropped out by the time that vote was counted. And that happened also in these states, about 1 in 10 ballots, but those voters had a chance to do a backup. And more than 9 out of 10 of those ballots actually ended up counting for Biden or Sanders, so that they keeps votes in play. And that's sort of the goal of ranked choice voting is to amplify your voice, give you as a voter the chance to do a second and third or fourth backup as you so choose. And voters seem really ready for it. And that simple change, and it really is simple from a voter behavior perspective, really opens the door to kind of a different relationship between candidate and voter. Then the last thing I'll say, just going well with vote by mail, is one thing that vote by mail really allows the voter is an opportunity to find out about more races that they might otherwise not know about, some down ballot race. Kind of similarly, in a ranked system, it allows you to know maybe a little bit more about that candidate you might want to rank 3rd or 4th. And because at the same time, it's these incentives created to encourage that. They really are a nice marriage, and it worked exceptionally well in these 4 states. Turnout more than doubled, very high rates of ballots being used, and we were very pleased to be a part of it.
All right, I think they just go next. I can see that I'm the one unmuted and not David, so I'll just take that. My name is Amelia Gardner, as they said, and I am the county clerk for Utah County in Provo, Utah. And I've been in office for about a year and a half, so fresh into office. And my reforms, I've really had to reform everything. When I came into office, under my predecessor, my office was dubbed the epicenter of dysfunction by the governor. And we had 4 and 5 hour lines on election day in 2018, and we're a vote by mail county. So to have 4 and 5 hour lines on election day in a vote by mail county is kind of the epicenter of dysfunction. And when you look at reforms, I had to redo everything. We had to go to all new vendors, all new processes. The only thing we kept was the iPads, but we updated the software on the iPads. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I decided to run the only ranked choice voting election in the state of Utah's history. So we piloted ranked choice voting. And on top of that, I also piloted mobile phone voting. I did it initially with our military and overseas members because the current process was not adequately serving our citizens overseas. And then that was so successful that we expanded it for our disabled voters. And the beauty of that is, as crazy as that was in 2019, in 2020, when our political parties in the state of Utah had to cancel their conventions, all of a sudden, all the political parties had to use ranked choice voting, and they had to use cell phones. And I had done ranked choice voting with cell phones in the previous election. So I was able to help our political parties with actual experience. We were able to successfully implement ranked choice voting and mobile voting in one election. The next thing I'm doing is this upcoming primary will also be doing drive-through voting for those that didn't get their ballot in the mail on election day. So that's my next big reform that I'm piloting. It's just been one right after another for the last 18 months.
Great. Top that, Vicki. Can you?
There we go. Yes.
There you go.
Well, that is going to be hard to top, but it sounds like she's got some things too I want to talk to her about for future reference. So I am coming to this very novice. I became the chair of the Kansas Democratic Party in March of last year. And of course, the driving force for me was to put together a delegate selection plan that we would be able to implement for the DNC convention this year. And that would meant, having a presidential primary to be able to select our delegates. And when I sat down with the leadership here in this state, we were just looking to, well, number one, we reviewed what had happened in 2016, where we used a caucus system to select our presidential nominees. So that caucus system really was not very inclusive and prevented people from being able to participate because there were long distances to drive to get to the caucus, or it happened, just within a short window of time. So we just kind of did some brainstorming and said, what would be the best thing that we think could happen to get more voters to participate and make this more accessible? And we talked about mailing them ballots and using a ranked choice ballot so that it kind of gives a little bit of flexibility and the choices that the caucus also allows for realigning. So those were two things immediately on our radar, and I was very fortunate to get connected with Rob, Richie, and Amber, and they helped us great. So by December of last year, we were planning an all-mail ballot with some in-person settings and the ranked choice ballot. As it turned out, we were very, very glad that we had already put in place the mailing of all the ballots, because as the COVID-19 thing became a reality, we had to basically cancel the in-person voting and rely entirely on the mail ballots that we had used. And so for us, it worked out like a dream. Very, very, very thankful that all worked out, and very thankful for the help that we got from these agencies and these people. So
right. Well, thank you to each of the four of you who bring interesting, different perspective to the topic at hand. Moderator's challenge is to try and give you all a way to contribute going forward. I guess let's start with this, which is, so now here we are. We're 5 months out from the general election. Most of the primaries have happened, but not far from all of them. What's keeping you up at night now in terms of getting ready for November? In terms of sort of preparation, logistical preparation, as well as sort of voter confusion or customer confusion. So I guess I'll start with I'm going to let Amber finish so she can plug because I know she might have the longest roster of things. But in Amelia and Vicky, what's keeping you up at night at the moment?
Well, I'll just jump in. It's just making sure that the electorate understands, anytime you make a little bit of a change, it's getting that information out to the electorate so they fully understand. Because we were a party-run primary in Kansas, there was still so much confusion, and county clerks were constantly getting asked questions about this upcoming primary, and it was just very difficult. So I think that just laying the foundation and making sure that the electorate knows exactly what the election is going to look like, when the ballots are coming out, and all of the details that way. And we were flooded with questions and phone calls and emails also. So if there would have been a way to prevent some of the misinformation or misunderstanding, I would have jumped on that. So I would say get ready for that first.
Are you, just to follow up quickly, are you as the party chairperson, is there complicated messaging that you need to do to get Kansas Democrats, ready to do what you hope they do this fall, or is it pretty straightforward?
Well, we're fortunate that Kansas has had available mail ballots. They have to be requested, and our Secretary of State has already mailed out applications for voters to request that ballot. So as a party, we are working already very hard to make sure that our Democrats get those applications mailed back in, so they'll be sure to be mailed a ballot come primary and the general election. So that's our focus, is just since it's going to be very accessible, we want to make sure that they understand what they have to do to get their mail ballot.
Great. Amelia, over to you. What's on your mind?
We actually are in an active election now. Our election day is June 30th, and we dropped our mail-in ballots in the post office this morning. So we just dropped mails. The north half of my county will be receiving their ballots tomorrow. The southern half will probably receive them Wednesday. So we just came in, and what keeps me up right now is changes. The legislature, in an effort to be helpful to the county clerks, they went in April in a special session and changed election law around this election. And I know there's several legislators on the line, and the one thing that I would urge them to do is, if you're going to go through this process to help your election administrators, before you draft a law, consult your election administrators. Because I had already, for example, the law that was drafted was to help protect poll workers. I can promise you I have the best interest of my poll workers in mind. And the law was also intended to help people have accessibility to the polls. I have that on the forefront of my mind. And there were several things that I've had to do that are causing, some issues that are preventing me from serving the public in this law. But my biggest issue is making sure that, as Vicky said, and as Amber is actively involved in, making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote in my jurisdiction has the opportunity to vote. We've taken away same-day voter registration. People are used to that. So if people have moved, we have 2 major universities in my county, and those polling locations near those universities tend to have really high voter same-day registration. I'm worried about that. I'm worried that we're gonna have college students showing up at these drive-through voting locations on June 30th, and we're going to have to turn them away because we no longer have same-day voter registration for the primary because of COVID. Luckily, I'm far ahead of my peers because we do vote by mail. We do universal vote by mail. And I have a way, my mobile voting that I piloted for the disabled community, I have a way for people with disabilities who maybe can't mark a paper ballot. I already have a way for them to cast their ballot, but just getting the word out so that they know that we've got them taken care of. That's our biggest concern.
Amber, let's go to you next. We'll do Rob last because I have a sort of his agenda. I'm just guessing will be slightly different than Amber to follow on what Amelia was just saying.
Sure. Well, and let me just a second kind of go back to my time as an election official. I ran elections for 13 years, was director in Denver for 7. And to the point that Amelia just brought up, what happens across the country, and I know there's a lot of policymakers on the line, what happens is legislation gets drafted without the experts that run elections involved. And we did that differently in Colorado. I actually helped to design and craft what would become the model in Colorado, along with a few other county clerks, and we got the technical pieces right. And that's really important. And now when we're seeing issues happen around the country, it's really because the policies are very outdated in most states. They don't accommodate what voters' needs are, and they certainly don't support election officials in any meaningful way. And so as I've been sort of describing with regards to some of the recent primaries that we've seen where there have been issues, we can actually go back and find out that it's one of two things. It's either a policy that needs to be changed and needs to be updated, that essentially ties the hands of election officials to do anything meaningful, like what we saw in Wisconsin, like some of the issues we just saw in the last week, or it's an implementation problem where maybe resources aren't available enough that need to be in terms of poll workers or locations or machines or any of those sorts of things. So I always sort of like to change, sort of separate those two things into those buckets, because often they are not tied together, and they need to be for the change to be effective. And then just going back to my time in Denver, I ran 3 different presidential elections, multiple cycles, multiple transitions of different systems, paper ballots to machines to vote centers, all of that, right? All of that innovation. Denver also created the first ever ballot tracking solution in the country way back in 2009. In fact, right as we were getting on this call, I got my text that said, hey, your ballot is going to be coming out to you this week. The June primary is coming up. That kind of innovation hasn't made it across the country yet. And that is exactly the type of technology support for the voter, putting voters first, that improves the overall experience, improves the security of the election, improves integrity, and provides voters that respectful customer service process that they deserve and they need. So I'm glad, I think that all kind of describes certainly how I see things, and then that's really what we're focused on, is connecting the policy and implementation piece and making sure it's effective.
Great. I'm going to go to Rob for just a minute. Some questions are starting to come into the queue, which is wonderful. I just wanted one little bit of housekeeping. If you don't mind telling us as part of your question, you don't need to give a whole bio, but are you a member of the media? Are you a policymaker? Are you an advocate? Just because we want to make sure that our media participants and our legislator participants sort of get first crack at these folks. So thank you as you type your questions in. So Rob, you're coming at this maybe from a slightly different perspective. What's worrying you heading into the fall?
Well, I'll make a segue to ranked choice voting, but there is a straightforward connection as well. I mean, everything's that's been said makes sense. And sort of speaking to Amber's point, as we've dealt with COVID-19, it's been important to have health experts and those who really understand the facts about health to help guide policy. And it's a very similar issue. We just had primaries here in Maryland and some nearby jurisdictions. I have my 3 voting age kids home, 2 of whom don't vote in Maryland. But each of them had these sort of complexities with the change that didn't really work very well, right? So young people in particular can get kind of lost in sort of poorly handled changes, particularly with COVID-19. And I think that part of this is an accountability exercise, and it's challenging to sort of finger a particular person to feel accountable. But I think just the way that governors kind of stepped up and generally felt accountable for COVID-19, I think that even though they're not the ones to often do something, I think if they feel accountability and make sure those who are directly involved are acting and essentially defining the needs for how much it's going to cost, and we still have to mobilize more resources to do this well, and that has to happen super fast. And state legislators, I think, can be part of kind of urging a regime of identifying the needs and kind of getting them in place, because we did just see that these recent primaries, even though some of it went well, there were some real challenges that I think could be avoided with both smarts and resources. I'll say one that segues to ranked choice voting. We have, because ranked choice voting is in these early adoptions, they often have to do somewhat workaround ways of counting the system, counting the ballots, that has slowed when we learn winners. And that's not actually always true and doesn't need to be true. It just has been true in some cases. And as we do some of these new changes, that's going to happen to us in a lot of states that aren't familiar with the fact that on election night, there'll be a certain set of numbers, and those numbers may change as more ballots are counted. And I think that in a very contentious time we're in, with a lot of emotion and impact to who wins and loses these big elections in November, people are going to have to take a deep breath and kind of be ready for the fact that election night outcomes may be different from what they ultimately are 2 or 3 days later. And we have to have people be ready for that, because I think in that space of uncertainty, those who end up losing elections could be sort of raising questions of confidence and security. So ranked choice voting specifically is going to be used in Maine. We hope for president, but for sure for US Senate and US House. If they're close elections, we won't know winners for sure for a week. But that's actually just the tip of an iceberg of what might happen in a lot of these close states. So we need to get ready for that.
So that's a great segue to the last question I want to ask before we go to the queue, which is, to me, what I'm getting asked as a member of the media a lot is, what are you doing as a reporter, as an editor, to try and prepare the country for this being an election night like no other? And I guess I'm just wondering what is, in other words, it's not going to, an election night in which, I mean, yes, we didn't know the result after Florida in 2000. We actually didn't know the result in 2004 until the middle of the next afternoon when Hamilton County, Ohio came through. I think most of us are expecting that if the election stays as close as it currently is, and it's at the moment in the popular vote not all that close, we may not know definitively who won the presidential race for a day or two. What are you doing how are each of you approaching that? So I don't know, let's go to Amelia. She's probably approaching it from the.
How are we approaching
Have you started messaging this to the public? I mean, is there a?
Absolutely. Yes. So our state, our lieutenant governor's office is the state office that runs elections, and they have been really good. They've actually put up billboards across the state that talk about how the election is going to be different. And then this year, I hired a voter outreach coordinator in our elections division, knowing that this year was going to be so different than any other year. We've hired a full-time position whose job is to communicate that with our citizens. But we're still going to have a lot of people that are expecting results on election night that it's not going to come. I, in fact, this morning fielded a phone call from one of the gubernatorial campaigns. We have a highly contested gubernatorial campaign on this primary ballot. And they were asking, when can we expect a winner? Will we know who won on election night? And I had to tell them, no, I don't think we're going to know who won on election night. This is a tight race. It's a four-way race that we are not using ranked choice voting for, which I personally think we should be using ranked choice voting in a tight four-way governor's race. But we're not using ranked choice voting, and we are primarily a vote by mail. And because of changes with the legislature, we can't even release our first results until 10 p.m. And on top of that, they extended the deadline until election day for postmarking your ballots. There's so many changes. There's no way we're going to get results. And the best way is to message that. I have active social media ads, paid ads that we are paying for from the county level. The state is putting up billboards, but I can promise you it's still not going to be enough. We really need the media to help us. We need the media to proactively put those stories out there.
Amber, what's your guidance there?
Yeah, I mean, so first and foremost, the whole election night reporting by the 10 o'clock news on the east side of the country has been ridiculous for a long period of time, because 10 o'clock is 8 o'clock in Mountain Time. People are likely just finishing voting. In the Pacific Coast, people are still actually voting, standing in line to vote. And in Hawaii and Alaska, people have 4 more hours to vote. So the whole thing has frankly been pretty ridiculous, and I think kind of disrespectful for voters across the country beyond the East Coast. And so that this whole election night reporting thing has always been a problem. It's been a problem for decades. And certainly it isn't really just mail-in voting. I also have been, also sharing with people that this year there's also going to be a lot more paper ballots cast, because there's been a shift away from electronic voting that was sort of, you know, had its increase in the early 2000s, and that kind of started giving more results. But if you dig in and actually look at the reporting of results, it always has like 2% of precincts reporting, or then it goes to 10%. And if you look at the mail ballot states, like a Utah, like Colorado, you know, some of these others, when you look at those first results that get posted, it often includes about half of all ballots cast, which is actually way more than what you see in the eastern side of the country. But the reality is, because you can accept postmark, because ballots can come in on election day, there is that extra processing time, and paper ballots just themselves, with the chain of custody, auditing, how we do all of that work, takes longer to process. So I just think it's kind of, it's a complicated issue because it's always been a problem, but also paper ballots and mail ballots in particular will extend the period of time.
So a question, the first question in the queue sort of follows on this, which is there any effort in any local jurisdictions that any of you are aware of to get election volunteers or training poll workers or training sort of a cadre of people to sort of spread the word at the grassroots to help, you know, combat the disinformation that the election's been stolen because we don't know who the winner was by the time we go to bed on election night? Is this something that's happening at the grassroots levels, or should it?
I'll just jump in really quick. I mean, we're certainly working on some of this. I mean, there's not only this narrative, but there's also a lot of misinformation about voting fraud, security of vote by mail, all those issues. And so we've assembled a reference guide. It's on our website, voteathome.org, where we talk about these things. We've got a Mythbuster type document that we also talk about. And then we're in the process also of creating a communications toolkit that's actually going to be designed for election officials. And we've already done some work in a few states to help them with how they're communicating about vote by mail. And part of that package within that toolkit will be this very topic of how do you clearly communicate about expectations around results and what to expect and what the public should be able to see. And then I just think it's really important to be very transparent. So educating the media, you yourself in your locality, if you're an election official or within a state, it's really important to bring them in, tour them around the office, explain to them why the process takes longer than sort of the flip of the switch kind of thing that a lot of people think happens. Like that individual ballot that you send in or that vote that you cast in person, something has to happen with it on the back end. And there's a process associated with that, with COVID, social distancing, all those sorts of things that are happening now, not only in polling places and vote centers, but also in op centers, are gonna adjust even the number of people that will be able to be in there at any given time doing this work. So there's just a lot of changes, and I think just being very transparent and communicating the realities is really important.
Yeah.
I would like to echo what Amber said. We do primarily vote by mail, but at the polling locations, we do paper at the polls. So all of ours are paper ballots, and they have to be counted and they have to come back. And setting expectations is huge. Every citizen and every legislator that I walk through my ballot center. Typically a week before the election, when we have active ballots coming back, I will ask people to come in, and I love to give tours of that ballot center. The more people that see it, the better expectations they have. But more importantly, the more they see it, the more confidence they have in the process. I've taken people that are just convinced that vote by mail is riddled with fraud. We walk them through our process. They can see what we're doing, and they leave with a lot more confidence in the process than they have before.
So nobody knows allegations of a lot of voting by fraud than somebody who lives, and maybe even a Democrat who lives in Kansas. So that sort of goes to my next question, which is a question from the audience, which is, how do you all, what's the simplest way to try and rebut or refute the suspicions and the fears that voting by mail is going to be a venue for fraud?
Great question. One of the things I think I learned in the election that we held a couple of months ago was how anxious people were about whether their ballot would be counted, because I think we've had in the past a Secretary of State who made it like, you know, voting was practically an illegal act. And, you know, you had to have everything, all of your T's crossed and I's dotted, just in, you know, to make sure your ballot would count. We had hundreds and hundreds of questions regarding, well, if I do this on my ballot, you know, or I accidentally, we had actually had a couple who microwaved their ballot because they were afraid of the COVID-19 thing. And they said, can we still send it in? It was a little bit scorched, but we really tried to work as much with people to say, you know, we're going to count those ballots as long as we understand clearly how, you know, what your votes are. And as far as fraud, we have people in our state, and I know I have had some questions in the past, the electronic devices that have been used for many of our counties, there was never any accountability that we could find, you know, for making sure that our ballots were counting. So most of the people the Democrats I worked with, they like the idea of paper ballots. And I think our messaging then will have to be, this is we feel this is going to be one of the best ways to get secure elections, but you're going to have to be patient and understand that getting those processed isn't as easy as pushing a button on an electronic machine. So.
A couple of practical questions right quick. Are any of you worried about sort of the logistical requirements in some states for notary signatures or witness signatures? Are there any last minute, I guess it's not so last minute, we're only in June, there's still several months left, efforts to make the vote by mail system legally easier by easing, not just easing the excuse requirements, which we at the Fulcrum have been paying a lot of attention to, but notary requirements, countersigning requirements, etc.
I should probably answer that, huh?
Yeah,
there is quite a bit happening. There's still legislation active in a few different states. Vermont is considering and moving forward on some legislation. Delaware, Rhode Island, Ohio has some active legislation. We're working on a few things in Pennsylvania and Michigan. But there's also a lot of litigation. And just last week, Tennessee's sort of limits that they impose on their voters from an excuse perspective were basically COVID is now an excuse, is essentially how that did. And it doesn't matter what your age is, because they were also differentiating between ages. That age differential is probably one of the biggest issues that I see happening in these states that still, they set up a different process for if you're over 60 or over 65 than if you're under. And the problem with that is the 26th Amendment clearly gave 18-year-olds and up the right to vote. And in a lot of ways it's, well, and it is unconstitutional to be setting up different procedures based on your age. So I think those things are going to continue to play out. It's anybody's guess as to how far that goes. But then there's some other things where, in Texas, where the litigation was happening on that front, the AG and the state of Texas fought back on voters getting that expansion, and they currently have stayed off any change there. And then Mississippi, I saw a post earlier today that I guess an election official or maybe the Secretary of State, somebody suggested that election officials, if they saw someone at a grocery store on election day but had requested an absentee ballot, that would mean that they fraudulently got a ballot with an excuse, even though they were out in public. And I just thought, oh my gosh, is this really what we're going to be doing? So there's a lot of things happening really in lots of states. And I think there's going to continue to be a discussion about changes, because the reality is we have to figure this out quickly.
Rob, do you think that ranked choice voting and other alternative election systems, that the eye, well, except in Maine, I guess, and Massachusetts, the eye is going to be sort of off that for the fall? Is that a good thing for your cause? So in other words, does it overcomplicate things for people to be thinking about just running, a good old-fashioned election in a pandemic, to then add a discussion of alternate voting methods?
Well, I think that can be sort of put in context. I mean, I think what we just saw this spring, these were state Kansas and Alaska Wyoming, Hawaii, had never run vote by mail presidential primary, had never done a risk limiting audit, had never done ranked choice voting. And they did it, and more than twice as many voters as ever before participated overall. And, you know, all those elements worked really well. So I think that you have to do the right thing. And I think for ranked choice voting, you know, we are going to have some first uses of it. The first, you know, potentially decisive use in a U.S. Senate race in Maine. So we are going to, you know, see it in a kind of notable ways. So I don't want to say it couldn't be done, but of course, you know, as we roll it out, I think what our basic belief about it is it's a win-win reform, really good for voters, really good for legislators and election officials. It's sort of something that actually works for a lot of people. And we want that to be sort of the narrative rather than, you know, the other challenging narratives that are going to be part of this, you know, very challenging election in November.
So we've talked a lot about voting by mail. At the other, I guess at the other extremes, there is the discussion of the continued need to keep in-person voting options available. And there are a couple of questions in the queue that sort of are about that and about what are you all expecting, or have there been any kind of guidance from the CDC or other federal agencies about how to design in-person polling places so that if the public health crisis is continuing, how to make that safe? And then sort of at the other end of the voting mechanics of voting is online voting. Amelia, you've talked about what you did at the party conventions. Is that, I sort of put the same question to you all that I just put to Rob about ranked choice voting, is going to an online, is discussing online voting this year just sort of one step beyond, and that sort of needs to take a back seat until a different election. So those are my sort of two topics, and it's a jump ball that I'm trying to sort of consolidate some questions into a couple of topics here.
So online voting has been successfully used in 10 elections in 5 states with pilots, and I've run three pilots with in federal elections. We've got the presidential primary. We did Super Tuesday. We utilized that for the disabled people and the overseas and military members. I'm not opposed to continuing to run these pilots. If nothing else, what we have found is that traditional voting has weaknesses. Whether it's a hurricane in Florida, a wildfire in California, a volcano in Hawaii, or a nationwide pandemic, traditional polling locations disenfranchise some people. I myself, I'm the youngest of 5 to a single mom who also happens to be legally blind. And my mom is very politically active, but she sometimes has a hard time filling out a paper ballot by herself. And a vote by mail ballot doesn't really work for her. And when I was little, she couldn't get off work or couldn't find a babysitter to stand in line for 4 hours at a polling location. And I want those people to be able to vote. And sometimes a mobile phone that has a voice over technology that's already configured for someone's disability is the best option. With our overseas voters, when we started running these pilots, we actually found we have a higher voter percentage turnout for our military overseas voters than we do from our voters right here at home. And that's because they have an accessible way. The key is to make it as secure as we possibly can. Nothing is 100% secure. Polling locations, paper at the polls, nothing is 100% secure. What we need to do is find something that is as secure as it can be within a reasonable margin of error. Then you run risk limiting audits, and we need to continue this process. Hurricanes aren't going to go away. Volcanoes are going to erupt in Hawaii, and we could have a pandemic in the fall. We need to continue running these pilots so that we can continue to increase access and participation in the future.
Who wants to talk about sort of at the other end of the spectrum? Is there an answer to the quite specific question about guidelines for in-person voting and making sure they're safe? And that sort of ties in a little bit to another question about funding and the continued, what seems like sort of a stall, a pretty big and long stall a few miles from here at the Capitol about a second wave of federal aid.
I haven't seen any specific guidelines as far as numbers go. I saw they asked for specific numbers. I've seen basic guidelines for poll workers, but I haven't seen anything as far as restricting numbers and polling locations. Amber, were you gonna jump in?
Yeah, I think everything I've seen is general guidance, but I think like it sort of depends on the space and the constraints and, you know, the machines. And so it's going to be very specific to the locations. I think certainly there are standards and guidelines, and states are trying to figure out how to incorporate that into everything that they're doing and managing right now. And I know that there's been regular calls with some of the federal officials and state and local election officials in terms of adopting some of those best practices and trying to figure out what that's going to look like. But honestly, that's like when you see the 7-hour lines in, say, Georgia, like what we saw on Friday during early voting, or we saw, you know, DC with, I think I saw someone waited 7 hours in DC to vote. There's a relationship for sure there with the COVID changes and just the distancing and how the machines have to be, you know, accommodated and wiped down each time and all that. But also, I think it demonstrates the resource allocation issue with enough sites, enough equipment, enough of everything that needs to really happen to make the election successful, especially on the in-person voting side of things. And, you know, I think the final thing I'll say, Amelia makes a great point. I mean, elections are very much about mitigating risk. And when we changed our model in Colorado, it was very much about that. We specifically looked at the significant vulnerabilities in the in-person voting process, whether it be resource allocation, poll worker training problems, location, physical security. No one ever talks about the physical security that is problematic at voting locations across the country, whether that be a natural disaster, law enforcement issue, a crime happening, which also happens. There's been cars run into polling places before, bomb threats, all those things happen all the time. And election officials have to mitigate the risk associated with that. And in a lot of ways, mailing a ballot to everyone, like what Vicky did in Kansas, what Amelia does in Utah, what I certainly did in Denver, and what a lot of, 6 states now are currently doing, mitigates a lot of risk associated with the in-person voting process. And so we have to make sure all of it works in conjunction. And if it's not working and there are big lines or that kind of thing, we need to figure out why, troubleshoot it, and solve for the November election.
2 quick questions that have come in, one of which I think these guys have already answered, which is how is important is a paper trail to the panelists? I think they've all spoken quite forcefully about the virtues of the paper trail.
Even with my mobile voting, we have a paper trail. So every one of our ballots, in fact, it's not tabulated. We consider it a mobile ballot marking device. We still have a paper ballot that it generates that runs through our scanners that we keep for our 22 months. I think those are vital for risk limiting audits.
Oh, that is fascinating. Another question is, and I have a feeling this can't be really done verbally, is do any of you, I'm guessing this is from a legislator who wanted to remain anonymous. Is there some legislative language that's kicking around somewhere that you all believe every state should embrace? Can you please give us the bill number and the state legislature that it's in? Or do you have any drafts or language yourself that you could point us to? I'm going to go with Amber, that she's probably the likeliest to have an answer to that. And then I'm going to ask one lightning round question in the last minute.
Yeah, well, we, and I'll put the link in the chat. We just released a 50-state policy analysis where we looked at every single state and we grouped states in terms of where they are in the spectrum of good vote at home policies. And even states like Utah and Colorado and Washington, Oregon, and California now that fall in that kind of 5-star where they're sending a ballot out automatically have things that they can do to improve. So every state has something they can do. But we tried to break down what those specific policy objectives are by state. There are some good model bills that have been adapted over the last year and a half. We can certainly point you to those, but I'll drop the 50-state policy narrative in the chat because I think that's the best place to start and then kind of work back from there. And our organization is happy to help with that policy design element in a state.
Great. Lightning round in the last minute. Will turnout in November be higher or lower than it was in 2016? And in one sentence, why or why not? Rob.
I'll jump in and say I think it will be higher. We saw incredible jump in turnout in the midterm elections in 2018. We live at a time of heightened passions about elections, and that the outcomes of elections matter. And I think we're seeing turnout rise in the midst of COVID-19. I think we will see it rise in November, but I hope we can continue to make it as accessible for people as possible.
Vicki.
I definitely think it's going to be higher. And I know just from the energy I see from Democrats in the state of Kansas, yeah, there's a huge enthusiasm to get out. People are actually, they're looking for change. And I think that the idea that their vote does matter has hit home in the last few years. So yeah, it'll be higher.
Amber.
Yeah, I think dramatically higher, actually. And part of the reason for that is the primary turnout has been dramatically higher in a lot of states. Just even Montana's election, I don't know if anybody has seen this, but 63% of active voters participated in Montana's election. And by the way, they mailed a ballot to everyone, followed by Colorado and then Washington, all above the 50% mark for a primary, which frankly has not happened before in those states. So I think the enthusiasm is really there. And some of the other states that kind of were in the top element, I mean, California has never really been in the top 10 states for turnout. They're in the top 6 right now for primary turnout. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, over 2/3 of Californians voted by mail in their primary that was starting. So I do think that that's going to continue. And the one other thing I just want to add, because I know this was a question that came in, I think in advance of the webinar, someone asked about the Spanish flu impact in 1918 on turnout. And so I did a little quick research on that, and that turnout in 1918 fell by more than 10 points over the midterms prior to that. So in 1910 and 1914, it was 50% and 52%. 1918, it fell to 40%. And part of the reason for that is there was no way for them to adjust. They only had the in-person option. There wasn't the same structure and sort of options that we now have for voters. So that's why I think it is going to be different. And thank goodness we have some options. We still have a lot of work to do in various states right now, though, to make sure that we get everything ready and get the infrastructure ready for November.
Just one quick shout out, Amber, to the fact that it's the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. So 1918 was the last election without women at the polls in most states too. So
somebody wrote a book about
why it was low.
Somebody wrote a book about that.
Yes, someone did write a book about that.
It's a good book. Amelia, last word.
Yeah, I think we are going to see increased voter participation. I think that in general, people are they're willing to risk COVID at the polls so that they can have their voice be heard. We have a lot more engagement, and I would like to give a shout out for Utah. We're celebrating 150 years of women casting a vote. The first female vote was from Utah, and it was 150 years ago, 50 years before the rest of the nation gave women the right to vote.
I'm going over time here because we've had 2 questions that are trying to steer me back towards the fraud question. So maybe we can do a double lightning round. Will there be credible evidence of voter fraud revealed after this election?
I don't know if there will be, but if there is in my jurisdiction, we will prosecute it. I'm very active on that. We check signatures on every ballot, and anyone, if we can see that someone else signed their ballot, we track that down.
I think, David, it depends on what states do right now to get ready and what processes get adopted. Ballot tracking, I think, is a key security component to preventing things like what we saw happen in North Carolina in 2018, where it wasn't voter fraud, it was election fraud, where voters' ballots were discarded after they were collected from them at their homes. And with a system like ballot tracking, we would have been able to deter and detect that, and the voters would have known that there was a problem. So I think that when good processes are put in place, like signature verification, cures, all because I always like to connect this sort of fraud discussion with any bad actor that tries to do something bad in an election. whether that be telling voters, putting a door, which we see all the time, a flyer on someone's door telling them that their polling place moved to a different location that isn't really true, and that misinformation associated with that. Or we see incorrect information on Twitter or Facebook that's misinformation designed to mislead or confuse people. Any of those things that are bad actors, foreign adversaries trying to do something to a state or to a locality. All of those things we have to be able to deter and detect, and then hold the people accountable for doing that, because our democracy, it matters to all of us, and we need to make sure it's secure and it's strengthened. And those are the best practices. There are a lot of these states that have done this a long time, including Utah, and all of it's in the West right now, but a lot of the Western states, we have figured out a lot of these things. And so replicating that in states that are building this up is really important, because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to Amber. I would not have been able to implement the things that I did as quickly and successfully as I did if I hadn't followed her pattern from Denver. The things she implemented in Denver, I've used that as a roadmap, and I was able to implement successfully in a single cycle these reforms. In fact, the tracking that she's talking about, I literally have that written in whiteboard marker on my window of things that I want to implement that we just don't have budget or time as of yet. But by the time I finish my first term in office, I would love to have that ballot tracking, because it really does let the voters know that their vote has been counted. If it hasn't been counted, they know that, and they have the opportunity to fix that. Really, transparency is the key. Transparency is how we take care of this, and following Amber's model that she laid out in Denver.
Thank you very much. So since we went to overtime because to accommodate the technical glitches at the start, but it's we want to respect everybody's time. We've now been at this for substantively for an hour and 1 minute. So I also see that our host Chad Peace of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers has reappeared, probably to give us the hook. So let me thank you all. Vicki Hyde of the Kansas Democratic Party, Amelia Gardner of Utah County, Utah in Provo, Elections Administrator Rob Richie of Fair Vote, and Amber McReynolds of the Vote at Home Institute. Thank you all very much. Again, I'm David Hawkings. The fulcrum.us is where you want to be. And back to you, Chad, do you want to pray us out, as we say at the church?
I just want to say thanks to all of you. Election reform, it's a very complicated space, and even for those of us that live in it, I mean, in this last hour, how many things I learned, and I'd like to consider myself a reform nut. So thank you all, and especially thank you to those of you who are elected officials and that have the tough task of administering it and balancing all this in these crazy hyper-partisan times. But I think at the end of the day, our mission's all the same, is to make voting easier and then to make it more representative for everybody. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, David, for hosting. And a special thanks to Unite America for doing the tough task of hosting the first one. That's always the hardest.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.